The United States has been a force for good in this world far more often than not. But as we reflect on our history, we must also face the hard truths about the times we didn't live up to our democratic values. Today, we'll explore the 7 worst things the United States has done in its foreign policy over the past 100 years. August 19, 1953, Tehran, Iran. Dr. José Fatemi, Prime Minister Mossadegh's right-hand man, peered anxiously out his office window. The streets below were teeming with protesters, their angry shouts piercing the air. Tanks rumbled ominously in the distance. Fatemi knew that this was no ordinary demonstration. It was the culmination of months of covert operations by the CIA and British intelligence group MI6. Just days earlier, Fatemi had been kidnapped, beaten, and left for dead by coup plotters. Now, as he watched his beloved Tehran descend into chaos, he couldn't have known that within months he would be executed by a firing squad. The Iran that Fatemi and Mossadegh had fought for, an Iran free from foreign control, was slipping away before his eyes. What Fatemi witnessed was the final act of Operation Ajax, a CIA-orchestrated coup led by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. For months, Roosevelt had worked tirelessly, bribing officials, paying protesters, and spreading anti-Mossadegh propaganda. His goal? To topple a democratically elected leader who had dared to wrest control of Iran's oil industry from the West. Operation Ajax quickly achieved its goal. Mossadegh was ousted, and the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was reinstalled as Iran's king. Driven by fears that Mossadegh's policies might push Iran towards the Soviet sphere, the US supported Shah's autocratic rule for the next 26 years. His secret police, Savak, became notorious for brutally suppressing dissent. The human cost was immense. The coup fueled an anti-American sentiment, eventually contributing to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. This revolution overthrew the Shah and led to the hostage crisis at the US Embassy in Tehran, poisoning US-Iran relations for decades to come. While achieving short-term anti-communist objectives, the coup's long-term consequences have been profoundly negative. The hardline Islamist regime continues to brutally suppress its citizens to this day. Just a year after Operation Ajax, in 1954, the United States again intervened to overthrow a democratically elected leader, this time in Guatemala. This time it was perhaps more about money than ideology. President Jaco Arbenz had instituted land reforms that threatened the interests of the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with significant holdings in Guatemala. The U.S. government, led by the Dulles brothers, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and CIA Director Allen Dulles, who had ties to United Fruit, branded Arbenz a communist threat. Operation PB Success, as the CIA called it, successfully ousted Arbenz and installed Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas as president. This action plunged Guatemala into decades of instability and civil war. The new regime quickly reversed Arbenz's land reforms and instituted a series of military-dominated governments. These regimes, backed by the United States, engaged in widespread human rights abuses in the name of fighting communism. The consequences for the Guatemalan people were devastating. The 36-year civil war that followed the coup resulted in an estimated 200,000 deaths, the vast majority civilians. Indigenous Maya communities were targeted, suffering massacres later classified as acts of genocide. Hundreds of thousands were displaced, and the country's economy was crippled. The Guatemala case shows how Cold War fears often led the U.S. to prioritize anti-communist efforts over its democratic values, with serious long-term consequences. September 11, 1973 marks a dark day in Chilean history. On this date, the US-backed Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, overthrew the democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende. The Nixon administration, deeply concerned about Allende's Marxist leanings and the potential for Chile to become another Cuba, had worked to destabilize Allende's government and encourage the coup. Pinochet's dictatorship lasted for 17 years, during which he committed severe human rights abuses. An estimated 3,000 people were killed or disappeared, while tens of thousands were tortured, exiled, or imprisoned for political reasons. The regime targeted leftists, union leaders, and anyone perceived as opposition. The National Stadium in Santiago was turned into a detention center where many were tortured and executed. One especially chilling example of the regime's brutality was the Caravan of Death, a Chilean army death squad that, in 1973, traveled from prison to prison across Chile, torturing and executing political prisoners. This operation, which killed at least 97 people, was meant to show that Pinochet's regime would be uncompromising in its repression of opposition. The Chile example was a classic Cold War dilemma. The US faced a choice between a left-leaning socialist and a right-wing dictator. Fearing that Allende would align with the Soviets, the US chose the lesser of two evils, but it came at a tremendous cost to the Chilean people and for US standing in the region. The small Central American nation of El Salvador became another battleground in the Cold War during the 80s. Following a reformist coup in 1979, El Salvador descended into a brutal civil war that lasted from 1980 to 92. The United States, fearing that the leftist Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or FMLN, would establish a communist government, provided massive military aid to the Salvadoran government. The Reagan administration poured billions of dollars into El Salvador, making it one of the largest recipients of U.S. military aid at the time. This support continued despite mounting evidence of human rights abuses by the Salvadoran military and associated death squads. These paramilitary groups, often linked to the military and wealthy landowners, were responsible for numerous atrocities against civilians suspected of supporting the FMLN. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in 1981 in the village El Mozote. The U.S. trained at Atl Battalion massacred an estimated 800 to 1,000 civilians, including women and children. The soldiers went house to house, torturing and executing residents, then burning the village. Despite reports of the massacre, the Reagan administration continued to certify that the Salvadoran government was making progress on human rights, allowing military aid to continue. The Civil War resulted in over 75,000 deaths, with the vast majority being civilians. Hundreds of thousands more were displaced, many fleeing to the United States as refugees. The conflict's legacy continues to impact El Salvador today, contributing to the ongoing issues of gang violence, poverty, and mass migration. The 2003 invasion of Iraq stands as one of the most controversial U.S. foreign policy decisions in recent history. The Bush administration, in the wake of the September 11th attacks, argued that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction and had ties to al-Qaeda. These claims, which later proved to be false, were used to justify a preemptive war. The invasion quickly toppled Saddam's regime, but the aftermath proved far more challenging and costly than anticipated. The disbanding of the Iraqi army and the de-Baathification process left many Iraqis unemployed and disaffected, fueling an insurgency. The power vacuum created by Saddam's fall led to sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia factions and eventually contributed to the rise of the Islamic State, or ISIS. The human cost of the war has been staggering. Estimates of Iraqi civilian deaths vary widely, but most credible studies put the number well above 100,000. Millions more were displaced, either internally or as refugees in neighboring countries. The city of Fallujah became a symbol of the war's devastation. In 2004, U.S. forces launched two major assaults on the city to root out insurgents, resulting in widespread destruction and civilian casualties. The use of white phosphorus munitions in these attacks later became a subject of controversy. The war also took a heavy toll on U.S. service members. Over 4,000 American troops were killed, and tens of thousands more were wounded. Many returned home with PTSD and other lasting physical and psychological injuries. The financial cost of the war has been estimated at over $2 trillion. Iran was emboldened, and America's international reputation has yet to recover. In 1965, Ferdinand Marcos was elected president of the Philippines. Initially a U.S. ally against communism, Marcos declared martial law in 1972, beginning a 14-year period of authoritarian rule. The United States, prioritizing strategic interests in Southeast Asia, continued to support Marcos despite his regime's widespread human rights abuses. Marcos's rule was marked by corruption, extrajudicial killings, and the suppression of political opposition. His government arrested and detained an estimated 70,000 people, with about 34,000 tortured and over 3,000 killed. The Marcos family amassed an estimated $5 to $10 billion through embezzlement and corruption, while poverty in the Philippines increased dramatically. U.S. support included significant military and economic aid. The Philippines housed important U.S. military bases, and Cold War strategy overshadowed concerns about Marcos's human rights violations. President Reagan even praised Marcos for his adherence to democratic principles in 1982, despite clear evidence to the contrary. The People Power Revolution in 1986 finally ousted Marcos, with the U.S. belatedly withdrawing support. This case exemplifies how prioritizing short-term interests over human rights can lead to long-term instability and damage to America's moral standing. Finally, we have the worst episode in recent American foreign policy history. In 1965, General Suharto seized power in Indonesia, ousting the left-leaning President Sukarno. The United States, driven by Cold War fears of communist expansion in Southeast Asia, actively supported Suharto's takeover. What followed was one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century. Over several months, Suharto's forces and allied militia groups carried out a brutal purge of communists and suspected sympathizers. Estimates of the death toll ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million people. Despite the brutality of Suharto's rise to power, the U.S. continued to support his regime for decades. In 1975, Suharto's forces invaded East Timor, which had just declared independence from Portugal. The invasion, carried out with U.S.-supplied weapons, led to a 24-year occupation that resulted in the deaths of an estimated 100 to 200,000 East Timorese, roughly 1/3 of the population. Throughout Suharto's 32-year rule, his regime continued to commit human rights abuses, including the suppression of political dissent, restrictions on press freedom, and the violent repression of independence movements. The U.S. continued to provide military aid and training to Indonesian forces during this period. America's foreign policy history clearly shows the dire consequences of sidelining our democratic values. To truly embody our values, we must place human rights at the center of every foreign policy decision. By prioritizing human rights, we can forge a foreign policy that consistently upholds our highest ideals and provides for global peace and security.